All right, so we have some participants coming on. Thank you everyone for coming out to tonight's Muskoka Libraries author event. I know there's lots of exciting things happening in Muskoka right now. So thank you for taking the time out to come to this, and make sure that you tell your friends if they can't make it to watch it on YouTube, because it's going to be going on to your library's YouTube page. So for those people who missed it and are watching from YouTube, hello, welcome. This is the last Muskoka Libraries virtual author event until after the summer. So you can catch up on previous author events at your library's YouTube page, and also see this one again if you need to. And make sure that you are following your library's social media page, that you are on your library's website so you can get information about our next ones when they resume, and all the amazing stuff going on at your library during the summer. So for anyone who is new to Zoom webinars, I want to point out a few features that we have. So at the bottom of your screen, you will see a chat feature, and you can use that to say hello. You can use that to let us know where you're coming from, when you're tuning in from today. You can let us know if you binge watch Degrassi to catch up for this author event tonight. There's also a Q&A button. So if you have questions for the author at the end of the event, please use the Q&A and not the chat, because we'll be using the Q&A to go through to answer all of your questions at the end. So if you have a question, please pop it in there anytime during the event. So let's see what else we have here. We begin this event by acknowledging that Muskoka is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, specifically the Chippewa and Ojibwe peoples, and the Algonquin. We also recognize the Wattamohawks, who relocated to Muskoka in 1881. The treaties for the land that we live on are the J. Collins Land Purchase of 1785 and the Williams Treaty of 1923. We are thankful for the opportunity to meet here and to reaffirm our commitment to the promise and challenge of the truth and reconciliation here in our community. Today, I am very excited to introduce our very special guest and her new book, The Girl in the Middle, Growing Up Between Black and White, Rich and Poor. She is a Canadian actress, screenwriter, producer, director, and author. And she began her acting career at the tender age of 10 on Owl TV. She was cast in The Kids of Degrassi Street. She portrayed Lucy Fernandez on Degrassi Junior High and Degrassi High, and you've seen her in TV shows like Nikita and Soul Food, and she's even developing a TV series based on the book that we're talking about tonight. So it's super exciting to have her here. So welcome, Anais Granofsky.
Hi, great to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit about your new book, The Girl in the Middle?
Well, where do we start? Where is it? Well, it's this originally started out as an article that I had written for Toronto Life, which sort of had a serendipitous beginning. I had run into the editor of Toronto Life, and I told her a little bit about my story because we were developing the series. And then she said immediately, "Well, you're going to have to write an article, of course." And I said, "Well, no, who would want to read about that?" And you know, this idea that your own story, it's so familiar to you, who else would ever be interested in something like that? And she persevered, and the article came out in Toronto Life a few years ago, and it was kind of a huge hit, and people really responded to it, and it had a lot of feedback and a lot of people who were touched by it, and sort of had a real attachment and a real reaction to sort of a feeling of empathy, you know, this idea of empathizing with many different worlds and being a part of many different worlds. So that kind of went very well. And then I was approached by HarperCollins to turn that into a book. And then, of course, again, I said, a book? Why? No, I can't write a full book. And who writes a book about themselves and all of these things? And Jen, my editor, who's wonderful, she was like, no, this is going to be good. Don't worry. Let's try it. And so we did. And that's kind of how the book came about. So it was a real push and pull for me. I wasn't sure in the beginning. And then as I began to write, I realized what a gift it was to be able to have this time to go back and to interview my parents and to interview people who, I would highly recommend it if it's possible, of course, to interview one's parents, because you often, when you're having these conversations, when things become awkward or you start talking about things that perhaps make people uncomfortable, you will often stop, because you don't want to push and this sort of gave me the opportunity to really break through that and continue to have some of these conversations and learn things that I didn't know. And you think that you know people and you think that you know your family but there is so much that you don't know. And in fact, I was able to see my parents, to see my grandparents as flawed and wonderful and caring and loving. I was able to look at it sort of as an adult and not from a kid's perspective. And that was really interesting and really quite beautiful. So that's how the book came about. And all along the way, I've been finding these kind of gifts that I keep getting from having written something like this. And it's been a really wonderful process, actually.
Yeah. You talk about a gift, and oh my goodness, because your book is amazing because it shows such different and fascinating family histories, but all coming tied together. Because the stories and your backgrounds, because you go back to not just, your parents, but their parents, and looking at the whole history. So it was absolutely amazing.
That was actually, I have to tell you that was one of, that was something that I hadn't realized was going to be so interesting and incredible. Doing that historical research was something that I hadn't realized when I began that I was going to kind of dive into. But the more I began to do the research, the more interesting, and the context around, I think that was really important. And that's what, my editors really pushed for. They said, you have to kind of bring it out of your story and connect it to the wider world around you. And that's what that historical research really did. And so I was as surprised and pleased but with that coming about as anyone else, and hopefully that comes through in the book.
Mm-hmm. What was the most surprising thing that you learned from your family's history?
Well, I knew a lot of the history. I would say kind of putting it in that bigger context, putting it in the wider world, because you often, when it's your own story, it's so personal that you feel that it's small and that it's contained. And then to slowly pull the threads historically, and because I come from such different backgrounds, but yet there's connections. And that's true for all of us. You can say that we're so different. And yet, if you really looked at different human beings that we say are from opposite sides of the world, there are connections and there are things that unite us. And so I would say that was a real pleasure. And again, I use the word gift. I don't want to use that too often, but was this idea of where is this in the larger world? How does this make a statement about the world that we're living in right now? And it was something I was hesitant to do at first, because I'm not a historian and I'm not someone, I think, in very individual ways when I'm writing, because you're writing from the inside out, but to be able to look at something from the wider context was a real pleasure.
Mm-hmm. I think one thing, I was listening to one of your other interviews, because you've had a couple, not too many, but there are a couple out there about this book. And one thing that you talked about was about other people's stories and how everyone has their own story. And I felt that was so amazing, because in your memoir, you talk about really difficult stories as well, like your father's story and your relationship, and how he wasn't around, and he had this really all of these issues.
Very tumultuous.
Very tumultuous.
Kind of, yeah.
But
well, and that's what was so what was so brilliant about interviewing him and talking with him and my mom is that you really see them. They were kids. You know, they were kids when my dad was 19 when I was born. And that was part of it, is that he was not ready to have a kid. And as an adult, you understand that. As a kid, all you do is feel these things because you don't quite know what's happening with the adults. You can feel what's happening, but you don't know sort of logically what's happening. And so to be able to look back as an adult and say, this was a kid. I mean, I have a 19-year-old right now. And of course it was going to be tumultuous. And of course it was going to be confusing. And that was really lovely, actually, to be able to see my parents as the kids they were, and that they were doing the best they could. And that's really what it came back to. And that was really wonderful for me to discover, is that all in all, that the people in my story were doing the best they could with what they had. And there's a real forgiveness in that, and a real empathy, because I am also doing the best I can as a parent, and failing often, and disappointing people, and all of those things. So I'm able now to really understand where they were coming from. But to get back to your original point, this idea that everyone has a story, and what's so wonderful about writing something like this is that people will come up to you and start talking to you about, I mean, I've had that because I was on Degrassi. And so because I've been sort of a recognizable face, people do approach you and come up, and you get to have these incredible conversations that you normally wouldn't have with strangers. But yet this has sort of been another level where people are able to say, yeah, you know, my grandparents, this is how they met, and all of these serendipitous moments that bring us all here, and all of these sort of moments where people could have passed and they didn't, and that's created a family chain. And certainly for me, being in the middle of such disparate backgrounds, I see how kind of miraculous it is that we all are here, and that most people are really doing the best that they can with what they have.
Definitely. And there's a lot of grace in your story too, which I think is very encouraging, because there's so many differences. And I mean, that's the book, growing up in the middle, because your mother was born in the United States, and she's Black. And then your father was born in Toronto, and he's Jewish. So you have these.
Well, and you also had the socioeconomic backgrounds, right? That my mom was really born into a very poor family, farmers and you know, domestic cleaners. My grandmother, and what I sort of found, and certainly my dad came from an immigrant family, but that lived the sort of Canadian immigrant dream, you know, that a family that came here and worked and entrepreneurs, and that my grandfather was an incredible businessman who built this incredible kind of empire. And you know, it's really quite a beautiful thing to bring that back around again, to you have these very different, and certainly my mom growing up in poverty and growing up in a large family, 15 kids. But what was so interesting is that she said, you didn't feel poor. because everyone around you was in the same circumstance. And it's only when you kind of butt up against other lives and see other ways of living that you go, oh, wait a second, that's how I grew up. But at the time, there was so much beauty, and there was, and struggle, absolutely, and struggle. And, and I talk about that for sure, but I really do come back to, there's a lot of beauty, and we tend to think, well, wealthy, then you're going to be happier, poorer, but that's not necessarily the case. And that's why these stories are so interesting, I think, is because you see the nuance and you see the love, and that there's grace, and that there's the love of family with my mom's side, even though there was poverty. And then you see that there was also, even though they were living kind of the dream on my dad's side, there was struggle, and that there was strife, and also there was the love of family. But so it's not all black and white, there's a lot of nuance in there, and hopefully that came across.
No, I think it definitely did. You mentioned about the difficulties of having poverty, and you don't really notice until you butt up against wealth. But that's exactly what you did, because you were living in poverty with your mother. So you're in the projects, and then all of a sudden your grandparents show up, and they're in a condo in this giant house, going to the club and things like that. So how was that growing up?
Well, it was many things, it was confusing, it was wonderful, it was a struggle, it was an incredible way to live. It was, it really, I think, as I got older, gave me a lot of empathy and a lot of kind of insight into different people and how people were living. And, I certainly, my mom and I struggled for a while until she sort of got her feet under her. And we were living in low-income housing, but that low-income housing was also amazing. You had kids from all over the world, all different backgrounds, packed, I was with in a pack of kids from all around the world. And that's what Toronto is, and Canada is at its best, that you have people from all different backgrounds who are living beautifully side by side. And that's what that was with my mom. And then to go to my grandparents, and it was mostly my grandmother who I spent time with because my grandfather was working a lot. And so to have her all to myself, in this big, beautiful house, and it was so elegant, and she had such great taste, and she passed that along to my aunts and uncles. And so it was I remember sitting by the pool, and I remember going for walks on these kind of rolling green gardens, and it was really, it was hard because you had to figure out how to switch between those worlds, and who were you in one world, and how do people expect for you to behave. So that was one thing that I really had to figure out. And no one, kids don't need you to tell them that that's expected of them. That you need to behave in certain ways. And this was, with people who I loved. So I certainly, I loved it. It was also sometimes a struggle. It was, I think that what's so interesting, and another thing I discovered through writing this book, which I hadn't realized, was that it led to my acting. And I hadn't even realized that. So here I am, 30 years after acting on Degrassi and acting in many different series. And I realized, oh, of course, that was the beginning of figuring out, okay, who do I need to be in this circumstance? And that led to acting, that led to an incredible career that I had, but then also led to therapy, of course, because then you have to drop that and actually be a real human being who's just authentically yourself, no matter where you are, right? So it took a lot of therapy. Therapy was great. So it's all of those things.
Yeah, definitely. That was definitely one of my questions that I have here. Because you also talk about shape-shifting. It has shape-shifting in your book, and this, I guess, ability that you learned young to see how a variety of people were acting in it. And I mean, it goes all over from religion, because you have your grandmother and grandfather's Jewish traditions, and then your mother's, I think,
Going
Methodist
to the church.
traditions,
Yeah,
and
in
then
Ohio.
your father joining a commune and having
Yeah.
this whole other very interesting experience.
Yeah, no, I was just talking with my husband actually and saying, how much that gave me being able to be on that commune with my dad and having a huge amount of freedom. And I know that for some people that would have been a negative experience, and that certainly people had different experiences. But my experience, it was so open, and you were so able to explore sexuality, and you were so able to explore kind of who you were without judgment. And as a kid, being given that freedom. And at the time I didn't realize, but there were no hangups. There was no kind of vilifying of sexuality and interests and what you were kind of attracted to. And so it was really an incredible way to grow up. But yet I knew that once I left that world, that then I would be going back to my mom's world. And certainly she had an incredible, she was an intellectual and she was a feminist. And but it was a freedom in a different way. And so, yeah, the commune was amazing.
What I loved about your book is all these descriptions. So you get this really good sense of place. And sometimes when you mention like, oh, it has great descriptions, people are like, oh no, it's going to be too much. But it's like the perfect amount. I mean, you talk about the food in different places and the music in different places. And it just really helps, I think, place all of these stories in something that you can relate to and you can really see. So that was lovely.
Oh, that's great. I did realize, I was like, oh, there's a lot of food descriptions, after I was done, but there is so much to that. Down in Ohio, you had the potato salad and the barbecue, and it was just meat upon meat upon meat, right? So you had chicken and ribs, and you had, these incredible pies that I was with my aunt when she was making these amazing peach and apple and all of these amazing. So it's interesting how food does stay with you. And then with my grandmother, who was an incredible cook, an amazing baker too. She was a baker in her younger life to make extra money for their family when they were just starting out. So my grandmother would set these incredible tables, and beautifully, the way that the dishes and how things were so elegantly prepared and presented. And so she, that was such a part of her world. And that's what I remember so much about her world, is these beautiful meals that we would share, and then of course you go to the commune and it's chickpeas and it's, brown rice and things that I didn't even know, greens, like what are these things? And so it does place, I think, people, but it is funny that you mentioned that, because I did realize later, I was like, oh, there's a lot of food descriptions in here, but the food is so indicative of the world around it. And so I'm glad you picked up on that.
Oh yeah, definitely. Because I mean, you talked about trying foods for the first time at your grandma's house. Like this is, I guess, like I don't want to say rich people food, but like things that you wouldn't eat necessarily every day. And then eating food in the projects in Toronto with this community. So this person is bringing this and this person's bringing that. And you have all these different cultural foods coming
and
together.
Fast food too. My mom, like, she was a working single mom. So we would eat fast food all the time. I joke with my kids now, we have these beautiful Christmas Eve dinners. And I said, our Christmas Eve was Kentucky Fried Chicken, like we would have the big bucket though. So that was fancy. Like we had the big bucket of chicken and we had the macaroni salad and extra big fries. And for us, again, that that was a celebration, and that was, something that we look forward to. So, again, when you think about it, my kids go, "What, Kentucky Fried Chicken? That's what you had for Christmas Eve?" And I said, "Yeah, but we loved it, And at the time, it felt like." And then we would go, and I would go for the high holidays to my grandmother's, and she would have a huge long table that she had cooked everything herself. This wasn't something that you bring in food. Like, she spent days cooking these meals, and they were so beautiful and so healthy. She was, even before all of wellness and all of these things, she was making healthy meals and from scratch, everything from scratch. So again, there was that as well, going from the fast food to these incredible meals. And I think even beyond that, just sort of how we lived in, a little 1-bedroom apartment when we started out with my mom, and slowly we got bigger. And as my sister came and we got a little bit bigger, not much. And then to then visit my grandparents' kind of mansion, where the room upon room, and so beautifully appointed and everything quiet. I remember that it was so quiet, because where I lived with my mom, things were loud and you could hear people through the walls and people shouting at night. And then to be at my grandparents' house, where all you heard, and certainly at night, it was quiet, but yet there was something unsettling about that, which was so interesting, because you get used to the noise and you become comfortable with certain things. So finding your way through that as well.
Yeah. Other than the porcelain dolls, which my grandmother
My
also
aunt's
had
dolls.
at her
Dolls. What the heck?
dolls. I don't understand it. I really don't.
I still kind of get when I see something like that.
Yeah, the things that you find at grandma's house. Oh my goodness.
No,
Yeah.
Did your grandmother, they were her dolls? Or were they her kids' dolls?
I don't know, because my aunts like this, you would stay in Aunt so-and-so's bedroom, and
Right.
they would be in a chair beside the bed.
Amazing.
Yeah,
that's amazing. My grandmother still, she was 98, had dolls, her porcelain dolls, and she had them sitting, and they were she would talk to them every once in a while. And yeah, no, there are no dolls in this house.
Not mine either. And this is what you were talking about earlier, is that the great thing is that even though you've had so many different experiences, and because I have never been to a commune, but there's so many things that you can connect to over these stories. So that's, it's lovely.
I would highly recommend it, by the way. You
yes.
can get to a commune. Yeah. And I, there was the one story that I told that always stuck with me, that because things were so free and clothing was very optional. And I was an 11-year-old kid, and there was no way that anything was coming off. So I had my bathing suit and my towel, and that was fine too. Listen, everyone's like, as you want. And that I had this sort of moment with my dad where I was able to, on the beach, we were able to sort of talk about early on. And this is when he was a kid again, but I was also a kid at that time. And so to talk with him about how heartbreaking it had been to have him leave. And he certainly came back, and we've been in each other's lives always from then. But at the time I had some heartbreak around that. And when that was finally discussed and finally talked about, and that's one thing that my dad really was so beautiful about him, is that he really was able to listen without becoming defensive, he just was able to see that there was, that there was pain around that. And then I decided, okay, this is it, clothing optional, I'm trying it out, and just kind of whipped off that towel. And that idea of being free at that age, where you're so closed and you're so embarrassed by everything, that the commune really provided a place where you were able to kind of try things out and feel free. And that was really something wonderful at that age, particularly at that age.
Mm-hmm. And that's, I mean, the one thing that I wasn't expecting from your book was that it was so focused on your early life. So I was like, okay, she's an actress, is going to talk about like being on set and all this,
I
but
know.
no. So
I got
we
to it
need
later.
more.
I
Yes,
got to it
you did
later.
get to it
Yeah.
later. And it's, yeah, it's snuck in at the back. But I mean, it's not a very, for people who haven't seen the book before, it's not
Yeah.
a big book.
No, you can have
So
one day on the dock, one day where you can get in there. I know people are busy. They don't have, you know, but I think it's probably a good read in that sense. That, and it was really interesting. I was working with my editors, and I assumed, you know, we're going to go into all of the salacious Degrassi. I mean, look, we were teenagers before phones, thank goodness, because I don't know what would be out there in the world if we had had phones to document what ridiculous things we were up to. And so I wrote, you know, a bunch of chapters about that. And the editors really, they said, this is a story about three women. This is about a grandmother, a mother, and a girl and a daughter. And I just thought that was kind of, there was something quite beautiful about that you keep it, the heart of this family and the backgrounds and how a little girl grows up in the middle of that. And that, you know, then later on, and who knows, we'll figure out where all those chapters will go some other time. But I was quite pleased, actually. They found the heart of the book and they really stuck to that.
Mm-hmm. How did you find the whole writing process and editing process? Because you've done, I mean, you've done screenwriting and you've done directing, and I mean, it must have, well, you did do an article. You have done articles before,
Yeah.
but how is writing the book?
It was, I have to tell you, it was so cool. It was so cool because, you know, with screenwriting, you're always trying to get to a point. Like you're always trying to move people into a scene and move them out of the scene. You're trying to constantly move forward the action. You're really, you want it lean, you know, you want to keep things moving. And you do want to keep doing that with a book for sure. Of course, you want people to, a page turner, as they say, but there was something that was quite beautiful about writing prose that was so different from writing scripts. And I've been writing scripts since I was 12. I mean, I've never written prose before. It's always been scripts because you're writing to then get to a set, to work with actors, to then edit. So there's all these next steps with writing, with screenwriting that you have to take into account. And you know it's going to change so much along the way. With writing prose, you're able to kind of take one moment and pull that thread and really look at a moment from many different angles. And you're not trying to kind of barrel through to keep the story moving along. And that was one thing, you know, that my editors and specifically my editor, Jen, at HarperCollins, she was always like, stop. What do you mean? Like I would kind of one point I said, you know, my mom was from a family of 15 kids and then I just moved on. And she said, what? Wait, what do you mean 15? Who were they? What were they? What were the relationships? Who was this family? How, the older, the younger, how? And again, when it's your story, you think, oh, well, yeah, you know, she's from a family of 15 kids. That's always been the way. And it was so wonderful to stop and to pull those threads and to say, who were each of these individuals and how were they as a family, and what were the things that they struggled with, and what were the joys, and what were the secrets that people kept for and from each other. And so, you know, to answer your question, that was such a pleasure to write prose for the first time. I'm a little addicted to it. I have to say, I felt like this is something that the slowing down was very attractive to me. And I really loved, again, I said this earlier, the kind of the historical, putting things in a historical context. So taking your personal story and then surrounding it with world events and what was happening at the time. And again, that was like, pull that thread. Okay, what was happening there? How does this tie into the bigger picture? So it was wonderful. I loved it.
We have a big writers group in Muskoka. As kind of a first-time book person, did you have any tips on writing memoirs or things that you learned along the way, maybe that you'll use for future books?
I certainly wouldn't profess to say that I know anything. Let me preface it with that. But again, I go back to this idea of interviewing people that you think you know. And that what I found was even siblings in a family saw things from completely different views and different vantage points. And I had my aunts and my uncle, when they read this, one of my aunts said, I had no idea that your dad was going through some of those things. You know, we just thought he was kind of out in the world and crazy and wild, but it gave her a perspective. And even though they grew up in the same house, you cannot know what's happening with someone or where someone is coming from. And to be able to interview and to not stop when things are uncomfortable, to not kind of pull back and go, oh, well, we can talk about that later, to keep pushing and to move through that. That was, I would say, that's sort of my biggest, that was sort of the biggest revelation for me, was to have this excuse to really sit down with people that you think you know and ask them these questions and ask them things that you wondered about. And you will be surprised. You'll be surprised at where they were coming from, especially if you were a kid, you know, especially if you're talking to grandparents or parents, if you're lucky enough to be able to do that. That was one thing that was amazing. And to pull threads. There's so much within one sentence, you know, to really look at that sentence and pull out details. And also what's so interesting, you know, Sarah, about memory, this idea of memory, it's so fallible. Even, you know, my memory, my dad's memory, my mom's memory, my sisters, they're all trying to kind of dig into your own memory. You realize it's so tied emotionally. It's so tied to how you felt at the time or how you were feeling about yourself. Or so to get kind of that outside perspective was really, you realize that memory is tied into so many different things, and there isn't a true memory. There isn't something that actually happened. It's just all the ways that people look at something or feel about something.
Mm-hmm. Do you think being a mother now puts different things in perspective for you from?
Oh, absolutely. Definitely. And I think I wrote at the end of the book, you know, that was really, really helpful, because you see, you know, how disappointing you are as a parent and how ridiculous you are sometimes, and how filled with rage and how you hope for things, and how you see yourself in a way that your kids are like, you're not that great. Like, you're okay. You know, like at some points you're pretty good. At this time you were not great. And you go, and what's so wonderful about having written this is I'm able to go, yeah, you know, I can definitely see how you would have really thought that was not great. You know, this is where I was coming from, but this, and I have 3 teenagers now. And so we definitely have different viewpoints on how things are going. But yeah, oh yeah, no, it's been a real, it's been so cool to be able to look at your own past and still have kids in the house, that you're able to say, oh yeah, you know, that was kind of tough. That was a really tough time that we made it through, and we did. And that sometimes they go, oh, well, wasn't that hard, you know? So the things you think are going to affect your kids, they're tied into something else. So, oh yeah, no, it's great to realize how, you know, how mediocre and how difficult you can be as a parent, and also how wonderful and open and cool and great, so it's all of those things. And I always I certainly have been given the gift of being able to see things from many different vantage points, and to be able to hopefully see myself from my kids' point as well. And my dad also gave me that wonderful thing where when people have an issue with you and have things that have hurt them, that you have done, whether it was on purpose, not on purpose, that you didn't even realize it was happening, to be able to sit and not be defensive, to be able to say, wow, that must have been very difficult for you. And I'm really sorry that hurt you that way, and that I did that. And that's a real gift with teenagers, for sure. You are apologizing a lot.
Oh no. But you still dedicated your book to them.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Of course.
Now, I see we have one question in our Q&A. So if people do have questions, please pop them in the Q&A area. One story that I loved, and I mentioned this earlier, well, before we started, there was one story that I loved in here, and that was your mom, when she was young, getting stuck in the library. And there's so many library, obviously I'm biased because I work at a library.
Yes.
There's so many great library references in your book. Are you reading anything right now that you'd like to tell us about?
And I'll just mention first about the library connection and what a saving grace that was for kind of generations of my family. My grandmother went to the library with her kids. My whole dad's family are huge readers. I mean, I wish they could be here to answer this question, because my grandmother had, a new book on the go every time I would see her. I would go and visit her once a week, and she had a book on the go. And my aunts and uncles, huge readers. I mean, just incredible how much they read, voracious, and dive into those worlds. And then my mom, who was, felt very separate from her family because she was such a, again, voracious reader and hungered for knowledge, hungered for an education, which she got that. She made her way to university, which is where she met my dad, and that's how they crossed paths. So she was always early on a big reader, and passed that along to myself and my sister. And I remember our trips to the library. I mean, those were big outings for us. And we would go, and how exciting that was. And certainly when I was younger, as an only child, to be able to have those worlds, Narnia and Judy Blume. And, I think I name check all of those in the book, because they were so profoundly important to me as a kid, to be able to disappear into those worlds. And of course, influence, I became a writer, and I was named after a writer, Anais Nin. So I was named after a writer. And then I brought my kids to the library right down at Spadina and Dundas here at Spadina and College, incredible library with an amazing kids section. And we went every week, and we would come home with, piles of books. And of course I would lose all over the house, and then had to round up. And so the library has really been a huge part of my family for generations. And I actually just read, I just read the creator of Degrassi, Linda Schuyler, has written a memoir. And I was lucky enough that she had me read it, just to be able to perhaps say something. And I was so amazed at this. She was such a groundbreaking pioneer and a maverick filmmaker, a woman in making in that industry, which is sort of a notoriously difficult industry, and how she made it through and not only, we call it the OG generation of Degrassi. I mean, there's been multiple multiple series that she's done with grace and with heart and with grit, and again, to read about someone who I felt like I knew. And certainly I was a teenager when we knew each other and in my 20s. So we haven't known each other as older adults. But then to find out all of these things that were happening, that you didn't know at the time. So that's the last thing I read, which was just yesterday. So I bring that up, and that's kind of in the memoir vein, which was just wonderful. And so when her book comes out, I'm sure you'll hear all about it.
Yes, definitely. And then it's great because your book's in the library now. So
that's right.
Full circle.
Full circle.
Full circle. All right, so we have a couple questions coming in the Q&A, and that is great. And we have a couple of comments in the chat as well. So John said, I loved the book, and I found it so interesting, I couldn't put it down. And now I'm looking forward to the TV series.
Perfect.
And let's see. So we have, one question from someone say, will you be involved in the casting of the TV series?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, you're really involved in all aspects of that. And that's one thing, it's interesting you ask that, because that's one thing that I really, I so look forward to. I started my acting career when I was 10. So you had mentioned that, Sarah, at the beginning, on Owl TV, and kind of these serendipitous sort of things that led to, not serendipitous, it was a teacher. It was my grade 5 teacher who had heard about it and kind of thought, yeah, I've got a kind of a loudmouth kid in my class. She might like to audition for this. And so started out on Owl TV when I was 10, and then really worked for the next 20 years from that point until I decided to have my kids and wanted to step back a little bit after having spent really almost my whole life in front of the camera. So I'm actually so looking forward to that aspect of finding kids and directing kids and sort of, seeing that process from the other side, having been a child actor for so many years and it having really impacted my life so positively. And it's what I'm doing now, and that's solely because of the work that I did on Owl TV and Degrassi, and that then led to a career. So I have just amazing memories of being a kid and on set, and I really found my world. I think I talk about that in the book, that once I found the acting world and once I found set, that became my world. I had been bouncing around between these different worlds and different backgrounds. And then when I found set and I found acting, that was the place that I felt that I could fully be myself. So that was a long answer to say, yes, I will certainly be involved in the casting in all aspects.
No, that's good, because I think it's 2 answers. Because Deborah had asked, would you say you had a good experience as a child actor?
Oh, there you go. Okay, Deborah. Yeah. I mean, look, people have all kinds of experiences, and I completely respect that, and because you really are in an adult world, and having directed and produced for many years, there's a lot of pressure in that world, and you're on a timeline, and there's a lot of money being spent, and so I understand that there's, you're a child in a very adult world that has all of these financial pressures, and you have a huge crew, sometimes smaller, but I often worked on things that were a bit bigger. So that kind of pressure can be crushing, and you do get jostled around as a kid because you need to be placed and but for me, because my early experiences were a community, and Degrassi was a community, and especially early on when it was just kind of a low budget world, that Kit and Linda, the creators of Degrassi, brought together all these kids from all these different backgrounds, and we became that was my closest group of friends all through my teens. I mean, those were our high school friends, and that's who we hung out with. So it's all tied up together, for me. And then certainly later in my 20s, then I was an actor on sets that weren't kind of my home, which Degrassi was. So that was different, but I was an adult by that point. But as a kid, it was really an incredible place, because you were also listened to at an age where it's so important to feel heard. When you're 13, 14, 15, we were the writer, Yan, who was this amazing, wonderful presence in my life and our lives, and Kit and Linda, they wanted to hear what the kids had to say. They were telling kids' stories from kids' perspectives. So they respected what we had to say and what we were going through. And we were encouraged to tell our stories and our opinions. So that's incredibly powerful. And I write about that in the book. It's incredibly powerful to be listened to, and for those opinions to be acted on. You would often find it would come up in storylines, and you would see it in the series. So it was wonderful for me. It was wonderful. I have no kind of dark, awful tales to tell about being a child actor. Maybe in my 20s it got ridiculous, but certainly as a kid, it was a really safe, wonderful place filled with friends.
Mm-hmm. This is a question from Chris, and they ask, why did you disappear from the spotlight?
That was a real choice that I made. I had a lot of amazing years, in front of the camera, and certainly as a teenager, it's the perfect time to be famous. Like, all you want is attention, and we got loads of that. We traveled internationally. We had fans were screaming our names and all of these things, all of these great fun experiences. And I think I got my fill. I mean, it was wonderful to have that, and to have that into my 20s. That was a really positive experience. And then I realized that if I wanted to be kind of the parent that I wanted to be, I had a lot of work to do. And when you're constantly putting yourself out there, it's hard to be an authentic person. And a lot of people do it really well. I just found that for me, the kind of fame and that was not necessarily how I wanted to live. And it was no reflection. I had a wonderful time. There was just another phase that I was really looking forward to. And for that to be true, it had to be kind of away from everything. And to find out, as I said, I was joking, not joking, you had to go to therapy, and you had to figure out, like, who am I in the middle of all of this? And what do I sort of see for myself when I'm not acting? So it was a real choice, and it's been wonderful, actually. And I'm so thrilled with everyone, from the show who's still out there, and I get to see them every once in a while, and it's so great. For me, there was a different life that I certainly wanted to live.
We have a couple of questions here from Amanda, and she is a high-level ESL teacher from Oakville. She's always looking for unique voices in story time, and she hasn't read the book yet. She has two questions. We'll do the second question first. We'll go backwards.
Okay.
And she said, will you be willing to speak to a class of 15-year-olds and about creative writing? Or if people are interested in, do you do book clubs, or if they want to book you, is there a way
Look at Amanda just throwing out requests there. Oh my goodness. Look at that. That's impressive. You know what? I have been doing different things for the book, which have been really wonderful. And I can only imagine that a class of 15-year-olds would be hilarious and wonderful to talk with.
Excellent. And then
what was the first question? What was the
first question was, how do you reconcile your love for your paternal grandparents and your mother, along with how your mother seemed to have been treated with being left to struggle with poverty?
Yeah, interesting. That was really, that was kind of the crux, wasn't it? Like that's sort of a big reason behind the book itself. So that's a great question. I mean, that was really what you're sort of searching for. And I think that what happens is that, again, I go back to, you realize that people were doing the best they could with what they had. And when you realize that, there's a lot of empathy. And there was a lot of, people are operating out of their own generation, and they're operating out of, what they knew at the time. And that's why this idea of love and family is so radical. It's so radical because you can't ignore it. And you can't say, well, they're an other, I'm this and they're that, because you're family. And love kind of does that, doesn't it? It pulls you closer, and you say, we're all humans, and we're all kind of not great, and we're all wonderful. We're all complicated. So because I loved them from the time I was little, and specifically my grandmother showed me so much love, that was never a question, so I always felt that. And only as I got older, and in the book I talk about that, when I really realized, oh, that's what's going on. Does this have to do with race? Does this have to, because all you know as a kid is that something's going on, but you don't quite know what it is. And then when you realize, there were times where I had to pull back and say, what's happening here? And then, of course, that's your family. And when you don't let go, and often people do, and families become estranged. But my grandmother wouldn't allow it. She was really very powerful and so loving in that way, that she didn't let me get lost, and she always kept me close. And so that was something really beautiful that she gave to me.
I think we have one last question here. And I mean, you seem to be answering all of the questions all at the same time, really.
Perfect.
So Deborah says, you are a very grounded person. What or who do you attribute this to?
Well, again, I go back to, as a kid, I was able to find a passion early on. So I found a passion in acting, and that passion gave me kind of a platform. And we use these words now. We didn't have words like that then, but it gave me a space to feel that I was appreciated for who I was. And that's unique, and I don't take that for granted. And I know that that was a really wonderful thing that I was given early. So to be able to find your passion early on, and to be celebrated for it early on, wow, that was something really, really great, and really grounding, to use Deborah's word. And also this idea of empathy, this idea that we're all coming from struggle, and from strife, and from beauty, and from love, and just trying to make our way. And if we can recognize that, and I really had no choice but to recognize it, because I knew that there were these different sides, and that they didn't connect for many reasons. So where was I in the middle of that? Where do you find yourself in the middle of all that? So empathy was a big one, and empathy and gratitude, lots and lots of gratitude, for sure.
I think we have time for one more question. And Chris wants to know if you're going to write any more books.
Look at that. I don't know. I'm working on the scripts right now, but I have to say, as I said earlier, writing prose was really, it was wonderful. Wow, what an incredible way to spend one's time through a pandemic. I can tell you that. Having teenagers at home and being able to escape to a little room and write was a real saving grace. I hope so. I hope so. I would love that.
Yeah, I mean, we hope so too. I hope so too. I can answer for everyone. So for people who haven't read the book yet, we do have it at the library, but you can get your very own copy if you would like to. You just have to contact your library, usually by tomorrow afternoon. So you can email them tonight. And then you can get your very own copy. I mean, it's great because it's short, but it's so good. So thank you so much for
awesome.
Joining in.
My pleasure. That was really lovely.
And I know, we have people saying already it's on their list to read. So
perfect.
I know.
Done. Then our work is done.
Our work is done. And I know, I hope there wasn't too much noise because they had to rebook an author talking about how to be still sexy after 60. So there was a bit of a party upstairs tonight. So since they didn't record that, we were competing, but I know lots of people who were attending.
Read that.
Right?
So where do we see that? They're having a party upstairs for still sexy after 60?
Yeah. Yeah. So I know a lot of people, because they didn't record it, so they deferred. So they're going to be catching this on YouTube.
Amazing. So. That's perfect. That's my next book. I guess they've already written it.
Well,
next to read.
You can read that.
Perfect.
All right. But thank you so much. And thank you everyone for attending. Make sure that you follow your library, social media, newsletter, all of that stuff, website, so you can listen to all the other events that are coming out so you don't miss either our virtual author talks with amazing, creative, brilliant women like we have tonight with us, or learning about how to be sexy. So there's tons of things to learn at your library. So thank you, everyone. And good night.
Wonderful. Good night.